Clear prop.
Star 73, Yankee number 2, following twin traffic, 3 mile final, clear subject, 1 Charlie Bravo, exit in runway 25, going 4 mile final.
This is Behind the Prop with United Flight Systems owner and licensed pilot Bobby Doss and his co-host, Major Airline Captain and designated pilot examiner Wally Mulhern. Now let's go Behind the Prop.
What's up, Wally?
Hey, Bobby, how are you?
I am fantastic as always. It's been a few weeks since we've had a good guest on the show, and this is somebody that I think a lot of our listeners have been asking for us to put on the show. And we have a dispatcher from a major airline and two quarterbacks. It's actually the same person, but we have Matthew Ryan Stafford. So if you're a football fan, you know there's a Matthew Ryan and there's a Matthew Stafford all playing in the NFL. But we have the dispatcher, Matthew Stafford, with us from a major airline. Matthew, thank you for joining the show.
Yeah. I appreciate you guys having me.
And this is also kind of like out of the last two guests, these are both first-time podcasters. So he's nervous. He doesn't know what to expect. We did a little warm-up, and I think we're ready to go. So I'm pretty excited about learning everything that a dispatcher does and had no idea some of the things that we're going to learn today. So we're going to jump into the introduction. So, Matthew, I like stats. So tell me, at a major airline, how many aircraft are in the air at any given time normally, you think?
I would say easy 600 to 700. Probably a pretty good guess based on like a day shift between 10 a.m. to like noon time period. That's kind of when the hustle and bustle of the airline's kind of kicking off. And just about everything is airborne other than maybe the last few wide bodies that are coming in from the international.
Assuming 150 passengers per plane, that's like almost 100 grand, 100,000 people in the air. Going to the bathroom, eating, all those things, right, are happening at once, right? It's not a small operation, to say the least, for sure.
Oh, yeah. A lot of people and a lot of metal.
And so I don't even know that I knew that there was such a thing as a dispatcher. I mean, I kind of thought that Wally worked hard, and now I think, as I've learned from you, Wally doesn't really do much at all other than steer. Sorry, Wally. But so, I mean, first, let's just walk through the job. Like, how did you find out about the job? How did you train to become a dispatcher? Do you go to school? Are you certified? Kind of just walk us through the life to become a dispatcher, and then what it means to be a dispatcher on a daily basis.
Cool. So to become a dispatcher, there technically is no college degree required, but you are a certified airman. You take some of the same testing as an actual pilot. A lot of people do go to college and get 4-year degrees, but it isn't a prerequisite to get your license. You take you'll take an oral and a practical test, which is pretty intense, like an 8-hour FAA examination to get your license. And it basically everything is like down to the basics. So in terms of hand flight planning, which one flight plan from Chicago to Nashville can take you up to 3 hours to complete, doing the ground speed, the crosswind, the course, and all that fun stuff. So once you actually do get your license, there's several ways to actually get a job. The most common way is to start applying at regional airlines. And most people spend 1 to 2 years at a regional airline before making their way to a major airline. That's one way. The second way would be working and being an internal candidate for whatever airline, already having your foot in the door with your dispatch license, and gaining your experience that way. Whether it's learning about the different airports and the different airplanes and systems of that particular airline. So those are kind of the two ways to get a job, as well as how you get your license. The day-to-day for a dispatcher, you go into work, you'll take on your incoming handoff flights. So you'll have all these flights that are airborne at one time. It can be anywhere from 15 to 30, maybe even more, depending on your airline or what region that you're working. So you will take on those flights. You'll be passing along any type of PIREPs, thunderstorm info, anything that's safety related. You're going to be keeping the pilot updated until from the time they take off till the time they land. So you're doing that while you're also planning up flights that need to still be worked up. So the most important part is, of course, the airborne flights, keeping things moving safely. But as workload permits, you'll be planning up flights 2, 3, sometimes 4 hours before the flight leaves. And you're doing everything from the fuel planning, the altitudes, the speeds, your payload guide measurements, anything associated with the flight. We're going to release out this flight, file it with ATC, and then sometimes we'll even do briefings with the crews, letting them know what to expect, why we did certain things for the flight. And then me and the captain will sign off on a release, which is then a legal binding document for both the dispatcher and the pilot side. So it's a joint responsibility for the flight. And that's kind of that I would say that kind of a good summary of how it goes day to day.
So you walk into work, most of us are sitting around a water cooler or a coffee pot and getting warmed up like everybody else. But I'm assuming there's, I guess I'm imagining, I might be wrong, but there's chair time, kind of like an air traffic controller or captain. Like you're in it and you're responsible. But you say you're taking on flights that are in the air. I don't know that I thought about that, but if Wally's flying from Honolulu to Denver, then he's in flight and you're taking over that flight from dispatcher A that was night shift or day shift. You're now responsible. He's maybe mid-Pacific. You take on his. Something could be brewing in California from a storm perspective or a volcano or whatever. Your job is to then keep him informed and get him to the end of his route successfully. And you're picking that up. Is that kind of what you mean by the flights in the air?
Yeah, and something that a lot of pilots kind of forget about is we don't just have that one flight on that route during that time. There's a good chance that we have 15, 20 all within the same vicinity, the same kind of aircraft type that we're kind of passing along reports as they go, keeping everybody safe. But it's not just that one flight. Sometimes it can be several. So the workload can be high in terms of any type of event or severe turbulence or volcanoes lately have kind of been a big topic. So.
And that brings up another thought that I haven't thought about. Matthew Stafford might be a great quarterback, but you're not in charge of the entire fleet. How many dispatchers are on duty at any point in time?
If I were to guess, so if we were to just talk about the four major, the big airlines, if you will, I would say anywhere from 60 to 80 dispatchers on a day and afternoon shift, and things kind of die down on the midnight shift. And a lot of desks will be consolidated due to not as much domestic traffic. And that is across the board for any of the airlines. But one thing that does kick off on the night shift is a lot of the wide bodies get going, whether it's to deep South America, Europe, and kind of like what you were referring to, the Asia Pacific markets as well. And instead of the 150 passengers on most narrow bodies, you're going up to 300 to 350 passengers per piece of metal. So
Matthew, I understand that you are certified. We talked about that, and I assume that certificate looks a lot like a pilot certificate. But one of the things Wally shared that I wasn't aware of is that you're not required to have a medical, and I think that's a unique thing about a dispatcher role at a major airline.
Yeah, that definitely an advantage to being a dispatcher in terms of comparing it to a pilot or an air traffic controller. is not having to hold that medical. I actually work with a lot of prior pilots as well as prior air traffic controllers that kind of shifted their experience in the aviation world. So it's definitely a good job for people that maybe cannot keep doing the original job that they thought that they wanted to do in terms of medical or whatever they have going on in their lives. But then they can bring that knowledge with them and become great dispatchers. And yeah.
That's awesome. The one thing that I think about is, and I'm a small business owner, so there's a million little widgets that I'm keeping up with every day that no one knows that I'm keeping up with. And I assume that's probably what a dispatcher's job is like. You're not worried about just the metal, the plane. I'm assuming that there's crews, both pilot, attendants. There's got to be catering that I don't know if you're dealing with it. Maybe there's 15 other kind of dispatchers that are helping you, but there's the plan, the weather, the crew, the other crew members, the ground, the gate. Like, how in the heck do you keep up with all that to be able to get Wally from Houston to wherever he's going, and then make sure that those fundamentals on that flight are taken care of as well? Like, who's taking care of the headphones? Like, I mean, I don't understand that as a joke.
Yeah. It definitely a lot of moving parts. Once you get into the hang of it, it's kind of like, it's kind of like just being in high school. When you first start off in high school, you're kind of nervous. You don't really know what you're doing, and then as you get comfortable doing it, you know what to look for, what things could be potential problems, what things are not. And you kind of just get into the hang of things. After about a year, you start getting into the hang of it. You know exactly what to do, what to look for, depending on what season you're in. For instance, so right now we're in the late summer, but summer is when airlines make most of their money. That's when all the weather happens. That's when all the diversions happen. And that's when most airlines hubs melt down. That's when our job becomes crucial to how an airline operates.
So we have this weird hurricane in the Gulf right now, and I'm sure that's wreaking havoc on New Orleans and some Florida airports and some other places. Atlanta's probably worried about what's going to happen in the next little bit as well. But what happens when Wally's coming from Honolulu to New Orleans, hypothetically, and he can't land there? Like, there's got to be a million little things that happen and change, and planes get diverted and other planes pick up people and take them places. I assume that's the dispatcher's role to solve all those problems.
Yeah. So to give you kind of an example, so you use Honolulu as an example, but if we were to shift gears, let's say you were planning something from Panama to New Orleans, something that happens just about every day that there's weather in the Gulf, there's actual airways or just invisible little highways up in the sky that we use to get from the Yucatan up to southern Texas, and they'll close those airways based on where the weather is or where the weather isn't. So we would guide him and say, hey, request this routing on this airway, and we would say, this airway's closed, or I see this other airline ahead, deviating west or east. So we give them kind of route suggestions while they're en route, moving along. And in terms of alternates, if he was going to New Orleans, we would be looking at Houston, Dallas, probably an alternate on both sides, and giving them fuel burns. That way the pilots are like, okay, we're going to calculate our bingo fuel to come up with if this happens, we're going to this place to the east, or if this happens, we're going to go, and we get to a certain fuel, we're going to go to this airport to the west. So just coming up with backup scenarios.
And this is probably to you two who actually deal with each other regularly. it may sound stupid, but are you really talking, or are these like messages through your internal systems? Is it text messaging? Like, how are y'all having this conversation?
So it honestly depends the situation. If Wally's if Wally's cruising, over the Cancun area and he's coming up to New Orleans, we have plenty of time, right? Plenty of time to come up with a plan and come up with fuel burns and, hey, we'll do this if this happens or whatnot. But if things start really going south, they start closing airspace, they start just scattering airplanes all over the place, right? Sending planes over to Corpus or sending planes over to Orlando or something crazy. We have so we normally rely on ACARS, which is through VHF. It's like a text message as if you were on your phone. So that's the primary. The secondary on the wide body airplanes, most wide bodies, is going to be SATCOM, which is a phone that's in the cockpit or a phone in the dispatch office. I literally hit a button and it dials the plane, and me and him can talk. Mm-hmm. For a lot of the narrow body aircraft, they don't have SATCOM. So we will be relying on radio operators. So we have one that is New York and one in San Francisco. It's AirInc. So we'll use them. We'll tell them the aircraft info, the flight number, and they'll patch us in. And we'll be doing radio comms back and forth.
Wow. So Wally, we didn't prep for much of this, but what are your views as a captain of a major airline and your use and or partnership with the dispatcher? Like what's your day in the life like? We talked about what Matthew does when he comes to work, but how do you interact, or how do you see your role and your crew's participation with the dispatch team?
Well, the dispatcher is huge. I mean, a day in the life is I drive to work and I get on the employee bus and I ride on a bus for about 10 to 15 minutes. And that's usually where I pull up my flight plan. This is usually now 2 hours before departure time, an hour and a half before departure time, something like that. I'll pull up on my EFB and I will see whether the dispatcher has released the flight, and about 98% of the time it has been released. So I'll look at it and I'll say, okay, we're going from here to there. We're going to Honolulu. I'll look at the time and route. I'll look at my routing. I'll look at all the fuel, I can accept the release at that point. Typically what I like to do is I like to talk to the other pilots, whether it be 1, 2, or 3 other pilots. And, because sometimes they catch something, I'll go in, I'll say, are you guys happy with the release? And 95% of the time they are. But occasionally I'll say, hey, I was wondering, they've got us on an extremely northern routing. What's up with that? And so at that point, a lot of times it's just a call to the dispatcher and say, hey, why are we going so far north? And they may say, well, there's a rocket launch out in Arizona today. Oh, okay. Well, that makes sense. I see that way down here in the NOTAMs. For most of our listeners who are pilots, they're used to doing their cross-country planning. Well, for us, that's what the dispatcher does. They file our flight plan with ATC. They send us a nice package of paperwork that's usually about 70 pages long, with weather, all kinds of stuff. Everything you want to know is in there. And then there's another aspect that we haven't even touched on is we have another person called the load planner. Another person who figures out, okay, we've got X amount of cargo, 51,000 pounds of cargo. We got to put 30,000 in the aft cargo. We got to put 21 in the forward or whatever. And they basically do our weight and balance for us. So yeah, we just kind of show up and start the engines and go. Not really. We do a little bit more, and on the longer flights, we are required to call the dispatcher, and we get a phone briefing. And most of the time, it's I'd say 70% of the time it's a very vanilla briefing. But sometimes there are some things to discuss. Volcanoes going off. Going up to maybe to Tokyo out of Houston. A lot of times we go up over Alaska, but if they've got a volcano spewing its top, maybe that's not very conducive to safe operation.
Interesting. Y'all both have said the word volcano more than I've said in like the last 5 years. I don't, and I'm shocked. A rocket launch really bothers a commercial flight. I'm being facetious, but yes, I think a rocket going to space would be a very bad thing for a wing on a commercial airliner. But all very interesting stuff and things that I don't think the normal public thinks about when they just jump on their plane and their plane's 5 minutes late. Making a deviation for a volcano is probably worth the 5-minute delay, no matter how important your flight time is for whoever's flying.
And I would say probably the most of my interactions with dispatchers en route are over medical emergencies. And
we've talked about that a lot. Yeah. Are you calling or talking to someone like Matthew when there is a medical emergency?
Yeah, well, he's the middleman, and we have this service that our airline uses that is we'll actually speak to a doctor, and okay. So if we have someone that's passed out in the back or whatever, we'll make a call to dispatch. Usually what'll happen is we'll get word from the flight attendants. We have someone that's feeling ill. We'll get you the specifics here shortly, and I will probably immediately send a text message to dispatch, say, hey, got a medical situation. We'll be calling you soon. And so we'll call them, and then we'll get a phone patch to this the doctors, and we'll say we have a 45-year-old male complaining of chest pains. We have an ER doctor in the back, and they will say, okay, give them this much oxygen, open up this kit and give them this drug or whatever. And they basically will kind of authorize us to continue or turn around, divert, and they'll make arrangements for EMS to meet the airplane. I'm on my flights, I probably average once a month, one time a month. I'm talking to the doc. I mean, I'm on a first name basis with the doctors now.
That's interesting, Matthew. You're touching more flights than Wally's touching. How many times does something like that happen to where you're getting a doctor involved for a medical emergency?
On the North Atlantic, at least once or twice a week. At a minimum. I've had it to where I've had something happen every single night.
And I've had a family, what I would call a family friend when I was younger, that actually pass away on a flight, right? Just he had a heart attack, and they were probably midway from here to Europe, and they just finished the flight, right? Devastating for his wife, and it's a real part of it, right? That you guys deal with, and I very rarely think about it, but not much you can do if somebody has a massive heart attack at 38,000 feet, like right between two continents.
Yep. Yeah, it's unfortunate. It's things like that have happened to me and around me, and yeah, it's kind of like what if that kind of event has just happened. There's not really much you can do but continue on, get over land, and either continue to your destination or stop short. And there's not really much you can do.
So from that sad topic, let's jump into some of the cool things that dispatchers can do that the normal public can't do. I think there's got to be some unknowns about your job, some neat things that we don't know about. Tell us about some of those things. And we talked a little bit beforehand. I mean, you get to fly up front in the cockpit. Like, how's that possible? And I want a piece of that action. And Wally won't take me anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's definitely a perk to the job. It really kind of opens your eyes to the pilot side, um, and lets you kind of see what the pilots are going through, especially coming out of some of these international stations. And you're wondering, like, well, why is this pilot wanting his paperwork 7 hours before the departure? Well, he's leaving out of a third world country, getting on a bus that's an hour away from the airport. So you get to really kind of experience what the pilot goes through before they get on the flight, and then as well as in the cockpit. You get to be up in there in a jump seat right between the captain and the first officer, and it's awesome. It's
Are you required to do any of that, or is that just luck, like a good thing, or do you have to do 2 legs a quarter or 2 legs a month?
once a year.
Okay,
So
okay.
you're required by the FAA to do a route call, is what we call them, and there's like time parameters, and you can reduce it by every takeoff and landing or whatnot. But yeah, once a year you're required to do it, and you can kind of you know turn it into a vacation if you want. But it's pretty awesome. You get to see different airports. I've seen all kinds of airports along the East Coast. I've seen them down South America. So it's really neat to be able to experience that. That a lot of people don't get to do that.
Oh
In fact,
man, I,
and in fact, that's how we met. I mean, I remember seeing Matthew's name on dispatch releases, and I saw Matthew Stafford, and I remember calling you one time. I didn't need a briefing, but I just wanted to, at the time you were playing for Detroit, and it was the off season, and I called you up and I said, "So is this your off season job?" And we had some fun with that, and so I would always recognize your name on the release, and one time you did actually ride on our jump seat, so we met face to face.
Yeah, no, that's awesome.
I'm guessing that Matthew Stafford doesn't need to make extra money in the off season, but maybe a passion for aviation that we don't know about. That's
Yeah,
good.
It's always good to
Yeah.
have a backup plan, right?
that's right.
So, one last neatness about your job, I guess. What's the schedule like? I mean, I work kind of day shift every day. Wally works some crazy hours flying across the Pacific. What does a work schedule look like? If you can share any of that with the public, like what does a dispatcher's work schedule look
Yeah,
like?
so more times than not, it will not be a Monday to Friday, and unless you're in like a staff position. A lot of times you're in some sort of a rotation, whether it's a 4 on 4 off or a 5 on 3 off, 5 on 2 off. There's different rotations that each airline uses for their group. Almost all of the dispatch groups are going to be um, under a union, so they have specific work rules that are different. So each airline has different work rules.
Sure.
But yeah, the work rotations are awesome. You work a lot less than what you realize. Once you sit back and you start counting up your days, you're like, man, I work less than a school teacher. So it's pretty nice.
Wow. So those listening that maybe want a job in the airlines but don't want to be a pilot, maybe it's something to think about for sure.
Matthew, are there schools, for instance, if I want to go get a private pilot certificate, I can go to the local airport and find a flight school. Are there schools that specifically do dispatcher training?
Yep. Yes, there are. They're everywhere. If you just do a Google search, flight dispatch schools near me, you can find a school. A lot of times the curriculum, instead of a 4 year degree, they take the curriculum and they squeeze it down. So you'll go, 5 days a week for 8 weeks every day for a few hours, and there's like a minimum amount of time that you have to do. But yeah, there are schools that you can go to that not necessarily have to go to college and get a degree and pay a ton of money. You can go to like a nearby flight school, just like for being a pilot.
Okay.
Well, I was going to say as we kind of wrap up, one, really thank you, Matthew, for being on the show. And then two, we don't record this show and then publish it 1 hour later. Like we always record this show a few days before we release it. And we just so happen to be recording on September 11th, which is near and dear to all of our hearts in aviation. And Matthew, I joke because you look so young on our screens right now. You weren't probably out of junior high when the real 9/11 happened, but how hellish would 9/11 be, or something like any event even close to that be, for a dispatcher and the work and the workflow that you would have to do to make the pilots and the airlines be safe in such a situation?
It would honestly be crazy. Just to think about the mass amount of airplanes that are in the sky at any given time, the increase in airplanes per airline has done nothing but, probably tenfold versus what it was back in 9/11, or during 9/11. I'm sorry. It'd be crazy.
And I would think that the facilities are built for like half in the air, half on the ground, right? Like in that moment when everyone was being grounded, I mean, you're going to any airport. You weren't going to hubs. You were going, I assume, to any airport, and the operations couldn't even handle all those planes. There weren't enough gates for all the planes that were going to be on the ground, and going to places you weren't used to going. I can't even imagine what that was like. I was starting my adult life in a career, and the one thing I tell everybody is I flew the first day that airports opened. And it was crazy, the amount of security. It's probably the safest day ever to fly because of the amount of extra security. But we appreciate everybody out there that does a job in aviation, that puts their life on the line at some level of risk that the normal public doesn't do. And on a really weird day in aviation that we all will never forget, it's a weird time to be recording a show with a dispatcher and a major airline pilot that is always subject to some level of risk that the rest of the public's not. So thank you for your work and your service, and we really appreciate you being on the show. Wally, anything to close as we wrap up this episode of Behind the Prop?
No, but thanks for being with us, Matthew.
Yeah.
Yep. Good luck in your next football game, Matthew Ryan and Matthew Stafford. We wish you the best. Thanks for being on the show. Lots of people have asked for a dispatcher to join us, so we really appreciate it. Hopefully we'll have other future guests. And for all those listening, don't ever forget to stay behind the prop. And thanks for listening to the show.
Thanks for checking out the Behind the Prop podcast. Be sure to click subscribe and check us out online at BehindTheProp.com. Behind the Prop is recorded in Houston, Texas. Creator and host is Bobby Doss. Co-host is Wally Mulhern. The show is for entertainment purposes only and is not meant to replace actual flight instruction. Thanks for listening, and remember, fly safe.